Well, it's 12:02 p.m. here on September 22nd, and I'm calling the Assembly Ethics and Elections Committee meeting to order. Let's do some introductions. I'm the chairman, Pete Peterson. What other committee members do we have?
Crystal Kennedy.
Christopher Constant.
Suzanne Lafrance.
Jamie
So
Haller.
that was Austin, Austin, Suzanne, and Jamie.
Fantastic. It appears we have a quorum. I want to thank everyone for joining us today on this rather cool day. Had 19 degrees here in my place this morning. And we'll start right off and get into this, the proposed changes to Title 28. Erica, do you want to lead us through this?
Mr. Chair, I would like to respectfully ask that if we could add 2 items to the agenda. They should be pretty short items before we talk about the proposed changes to Title 21. The first one would be a brief update on the upcoming elections. And the second one would be a brief discussion of best practices in elections.
Okay. Do I have a motion from someone on the committee to make that change?
So moved.
Yeah.
This is Austin.
Okay, it's moved and seconded. Is anyone against those changes to our agenda? If not, we will make those changes to our agenda. And thank you, Erica. Go continue.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. As everybody knows, we have 2 upcoming elections. The Juneau municipal election is October 5th, and we are assisting the city and borough of Juneau with processing their ballots. Their ballots were mailed 21 days in advance of their election, which was, I don't know, approximately a week and a half ago. And they will be receiving all of their ballots in Juneau and then shipping them up to us for processing. Our special election, the special election that the Assembly called due to the certification of the petition to recall Assemblymember Zalatel, that is, of course, set for October 26th. Mailed ballots for that election will be mailed on or around October 5th, with the exception that ballot packages to military and overseas voters were already mailed last Friday. There were about 177 of those. We had talked with the Assembly about the challenges related to conducting overlapping elections, and we wanted to tell you about some of our procedures to address those issues. One is that we plan to do processing of the Anchorage election in the mornings and processing of the Juneau election in the afternoons. So we'll be keeping them separate by time. And then we also have color-coded labels for all trays and carts that will be used for the various ballots. So our Juneau election materials are all color-coded with hot pink, and our Anchorage materials are all coded with hot yellow. And of course, also the Juneau ballot return envelope is designed and colored differently from the Anchorage ballot return envelope. So there is that distinction as well. So we are on track for both those elections. The first notice of election for the special election was sent to the Anchorage Daily News this morning and will be published this coming Sunday. We did offer a press tour this morning and did have one member of the press come, and we did do a short TV interview, so you may see that. So I think that's it from the perspective of updating you on these upcoming elections. Does anyone have any questions?
Any questions from committee members?
Mr. Chair, Constant here. Just a quick comment.
Go ahead, Mr. Constant.
Thanks. My social media feed is filling up with pictures of ballots in Juneau, so they have them and they are voting.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions from committee members or comments? Okay, thank you. Continue, Erica.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to turn it over to Barbara Jones to briefly talk about best practices in elections.
Okay, fantastic. Go ahead, Ms. Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and committee members. We have had a discussion over the summer from some questions that were posed by members of the committee about what are some best election practices. And just to remind you, some of those practices are extended early voting, which the municipality does since we mail the vote at home ballots 21 days before the election, and a little bit longer for our military and overseas voters. We also have a week and a day of voting at our vote center, and we also offer voting on Saturdays and Sundays. Another best practice is no excuse vote at home ballots, which means every qualified registered voter is mailed a ballot. Prepaid postage is one of the best practices, which we do not do in the municipality of Anchorage. I expect that we will have a discussion about that sometime in the future about why other jurisdictions do it and why in the past Anchorage decided not to do that. Another best practice is fair ballot curing policies. And again, Anchorage sends cure letters to voters 3 days after processing their envelope so that voters can address signature or other issues with their ballot envelope. And they have to get back to us by the public session of Canvass. So that gives voters 10 days after the election to cure any problem with their envelope. Another best practice is multiple accessible return options. And as you know, voters have at least 3 options to return their ballot. They can return it in the US mail, they can return it to a secure Dropbox, or they can return it to a vote center. Another best practice is ballot tracking, which allows voters to understand where their ballot is in the process. In the past election, voters could call our voter hotline and find out if their ballot had been received and if the signature had been adjudicated as good. And Erica is going to talk a little bit more about this. Another best practice that I've read about, and we can talk more about this, is that voters like the stickers. And so the stickers have a cost to them. Some voters don't use the stickers, but that is another best practice, is including I voted stickers. So we're going to continue to update you about these best practices and where Anchorage is at on this continuum. And one of the changes that we have made recently involves ballot tracking. And I'm going to turn it over to Erica to talk to you a little bit more about that.
Thank you, Ms. Jones. Proceed, Ms. Erica.
Thank you, Ms. Jones and Mr. Chair. So we have entered into a contract with Ballot Tracks, the company, one of the few companies that provides ballot tracking services. And I believe they did a presentation to this committee at some point last year. We are planning to offer their ballot tracking services for the April 5th, 2022 election. And we are working with them to do all of the setup and develop the details. So the way it will work is that a voter will have to sign up for the service, and they can choose whether they want status reports sent to them either by text message, by email, or by getting a recorded telephone message. The status reports, when they would get status reports, will be selected by the municipality. And we're still developing and determining what status reports will be sent. But examples would include things like getting a message when their ballot package has been mailed by our vendor, So a message that says something like, your ballot's on your way to you, and you can expect it, within 5 to 7 days. And if you don't get it after 7 days, give us a call, that sort of message. Another example message would be when we receive it back at the election center, that the voter could get a notification that their ballot has been received. And a third example would be when it's determined whether their signature is a match and the ballot is good for counting, or whether there is a signature issue and they should be expecting a cure letter. So like I said, we are still developing the processes, and we will have it ready for the April election. And we're really excited to add this tool into our toolbox.
Is there an estimate of the cost of the ballot tracking at this point?
So the estimate at this point is approximately $11,000 per election. It is a per registered voter cost.
Okay. All right, fantastic. Thank you very much for that update. Any questions from committee members on ballot tracking?
Mr. Chair.
Mr. Constant.
Thank you, Eric. I just want to clarify what you mean by per voter. It means that we pay per voter, right? So it's not a fixed price. It's a price that's based on how many people use it.
It is a price based on how many people are registered to vote in the election.
Oh, okay. So it is.
We would still pay if nobody
Okay.
used it.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. Any other questions from committee members? It appears
Mr.
not.
Chair. Actually, this is Crystal.
Go ahead, Crystal.
Thanks. Actually, I have a question more specific to ballot curing. So I don't know if that's a good time for this or not, but just so you know, and you can say when to ask it. Thanks.
Ballot curing. Okay. Well,
That's fine. We're ready to answer questions. It seems we were talking about fair ballot curing policies, so we can answer it.
go ahead, Crystal, with your question then.
Okay, thank you. My question is in regard to ballot curing from the perspective of the voter, and how the voter knows if they've done enough to actually comply with what's requested of them in terms of when they're notified that their ballot needs to be cured. So, I know there was some mix up about last time with, and I don't know how all this worked out in the end, but, the question was, or the concern was that somebody responded in the way they thought they were supposed to, but then they later learned that their ballot was still rejected. So I don't know if you want to speak to the specificness of that particular incident, or if you just want to talk about how ballot curing is actually cured or, accomplished in general. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Kennedy. Did you want to have an answer for that, Ms. Jones?
I'm not.
Sorry, I think I was on mute.
Okay.
So the letter that is sent, so you can have a problem based on a number of different issues, but the letter that is sent to the voter, particularly for a no-sig or no-sig match, does inform the voter that they need to return the form that includes their identifier and their signature, and that the new signature will be evaluated. And so the form doesn't say the return of this form guarantees that the problem is solved. Ballot Tracks is going to be a great assistance in this matter, because once, if they are a successful cure, they will then get the alert that says, you know, your ballot is now going to be processed for counting.
Fantastic.
Can I follow up on that, Mr. Chair?
Go ahead, Ms. Kennedy.
Thank you. I guess my question though goes back to if somebody believes they have done what they think they need to do, and in terms of a signature specifically, I think that's important. So you're saying that so somebody comes in and signs the form or sends it back, but somebody in the election center could still say, well, that's still not a valid signature?
Ms. Kennedy, this is Barbara, and the answer to that is yes. And I think Erica and I can give you an example. There was a person who appeared to be disabled, and when his ballot was returned, there was a signature on the ballot, and the signature, we checked the household, and it matched his mother's signature. And we sent a cure letter, and the envelope, the form was returned, but it was still his mother's signature. And so you are correct. We did not count that ballot. It was not his signature on file. And those are difficult decisions to make, but the signature did not match his signature on file. So we are trying to clarify those circumstances in the letter that goes to voters that says, we're clarifying in the letter that returning this letter does not mean that your ballot will count, you know. And we also have added to the letter, please include identification in some circumstances. So where there's a wildly different signature than what we have on file. So we're doing our best to make sure that every vote counts, but we don't want to count votes from people that are not the voter. So it's a difficult balance that we walk, but we're trying to walk the tightrope.
So then how does somebody know that it's still not cured enough to be accepted as a ballot? That would be one question. And the other question is, don't we already have specific accommodations in those kinds of special cases when a disabled person can't actually sign for themselves and somebody else would be signing for them?
Well, those are two separate questions, Ms. Kennedy. And
exactly. I
yes,
meant that
and the answer to the first is we do not have a system that notifies someone that your cure wasn't effective. So let's add that to our list and work on, you know, we're talking about fair curing policies. I think that's a fair item to add to make sure that we're notifying people if their cure was cured. And again, I will echo what Erica said, that using ballot tracks is going to be a much more effective means to notify voters than the mail. So that is one answer to your first question. Let's keep discussing and working on this. The second answer to your question is no, there is no provision in the code that allows someone that is disabled to have someone else sign their name. That is not what the code says. It has a different provision that if you are not able to sign, you can make a mark and have a witness, but that is not the same thing as someone else signing your ballot envelope.
Okay, thank you. I understand the distinction there, so that's good. So anyway, yeah, so I think it would be, I'm glad the tracking might help with getting people the information that they might need. But I am still concerned about how we can still tell somebody, well, we still don't believe you that that's your signature. But anyway, hopefully we can fine tune that a little bit more for those times when obviously there's just a specific situation that arises that kind of calls for, clarification. So thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Kennedy. Thank you, Ms. Jones. Yeah, I think the ballot tracking system will also be much quicker and will notify people sooner. So it may speed up the process as well. So any other questions at this point by committee members? If not, then I think we might be ready to go to new business, proposed changes to Title 28. Please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Those of you who have screen viewing capabilities, can you see the draft ordinance on the screen?
I can.
Terrific. Okay, so this is a draft ordinance, and these are proposed amendments to Title 28 that are being set forth by the elections team. So I'm going to skip the whereases for now and jump right into Section 1. So in Section 1, we are offering to add an additional definition to define the word tabulate. And you'll see as we move through this ordinance that this will relate to some other proposed changes we have to sort of clarify and distinguish between the concept of counting and the concept of tabulating, because we saw that this can sometimes be confusing to voters. And so what we're really trying to clarify here is counting is used sort of more loosely to mean a couple of different things. But when we say tabulate, we're talking about tallying the votes to determine who wins that particular race or measure. And this relates to confusion about our election processes and what we're doing at what point in the election. And so you'll see later on a section that you may remember that we don't do any tabulation until after 8 p.m. on election night. So at no point are there any sort of preliminary results being learned by anybody in the related to the election, the public, the clerk, anybody. There are no preliminary results. We only start tabulating after 8 p.m. on election night. So, so we're proposing to add this definition of tabulate to help clarify this concept. Moving on to Section 2. There was some confusion in the spring about the fact that the runoff ballot did not have a place to add a write-in vote. And so we are trying to make it more clear that when you create a runoff ballot, there is no space for a write-in candidate. And this is consistent with a couple other sections of code. Just read them out. 2820.040B4 is the section about notices of election, and it says the notice has to include the offices for which candidates are to be elected, with the names of candidates which will appear on the ballot for each such office, together with a statement to the effect that, except in runoff elections, voters may vote for any person qualified for such offices by writing in such person's name on the ballot and marking the oval or square preceding such name. So that's in the notices section. And then later on in 2880.050B11, it specifies that a write-in vote shall not be counted in a runoff election. So a runoff election as set by charter is between the top two candidates in a mayor's race if in the regular election nobody gets 45% plus one. So we're just clarifying that there is no write-in section put onto a runoff ballot.
Mr. Chair, can I ask a question? Okay, I think you're muted, but this is Crystal Kennedy.
Sorry about that. Go ahead, Crystal.
Oh, thanks. Okay. My question is, it's just kind of a, a what if. and particularly about if we write in that there is no write-in allowed in a runoff election. What happens if we lose one of the candidates, one of the two candidates in a runoff? In other words, they resign, they change their mind, they die. Any of the other kinds of things that we know would keep somebody from being in office, maybe a criminal charge or something. But anyway, what would we do in a situation like that? Would we just assume that the person still there or still available for the runoff, is still in the running, would actually then just automatically win? Or would there be the ability for the other candidate to actually be replaced by someone else? And maybe that's way too much of a, anyway, has anybody ever thought about that? Anyway, thanks.
Oh, Miss Kennedy, I have nightmares about those things. So of course, no, I think that that's a good question, but you still wouldn't want to add a write-in.
Another radical communist over.
Mr. Chair, I just want to make a note for the record that was Mr. Niall Williams interrupting the meeting outside of the rules of order.
Ms. Kennedy, so what I think what would happen in a situation like that, we would certainly gather together all of the great legal minds in the municipality and make a decision based on code and charter, and I'm sure state and federal law about how to proceed. And so certainly that could be a potential problem. It also could be that the assembly might have to say, for example, that, well, we're going to have a special election, or we're going to have a different election, or we're not going to certify this election. But there are so many options that could happen because of that. But what I want to tell you is that should not encourage you to have a write-in on a runoff. The whole point of the runoff election is that two candidates receive the most votes. And if you don't limit the runoff to that, you could have another situation where someone doesn't get 45% plus one of the vote, and then you never have certainty and your election never gets over. So we can keep talking about my nightmare, Miss Kennedy, but not right now.
Well, thanks, Barbara. I appreciate that. And I guess, for purposes of really what we're doing here is I don't necessarily want to mess with the write-in idea, because you're right. I mean, I believe it is a runoff between two people that the community's already chosen, the voters have already chosen. But I do think we might want to do something in addition to maybe answer that question in advance, get the legal minds together now. But anyway, that might be something for, to talk about here in the near future. Thanks. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Kennedy. And I think Mr. Gates wants to comment on that question. Go ahead, Mr. Gates.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to make sure you can hear me.
Yes.
And yes, I just wanted to comment that I looked at this specific question in the last runoff election, and I agree with what Mrs. Jones said and Ms. Kennedy's recent comments, and that's absolutely correct. There's no qualified candidate for a write-in in a runoff election. There's only two qualified persons in a runoff election. That's per charter, and I think that's a pretty sound legal conclusion.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Gates. Proceed.
Thank you. So this next change, which is here in section E, this is just a rewording that better expresses the requirements for official ballots to be designed in a way that they can both be scanned and tabulated through our election equipment. So this is just wording to better describe what it is that we're doing. Moving on to section 3. So this is the section of code that sets forth that we mail to voters at least 21 days before the election, and it it sets forth some state voter statuses that we don't have to mail to. So we don't mail to people who are in the condition of undeliverable, purge notice, or list maintenance undeliverable. And we are proposing to add also the status of list maintenance, LM, to this list. So persons who are in list maintenance status in the state voter registration database have had no contact with the State Division of Elections in the last 4 years, have no voter history in the last 4 years, and have been sent the first notice from the state as part of the state's list maintenance process. So these are people who appear not to be here anymore, but if they are here and they just haven't voted and haven't communicated with the Division of Elections for 4 years, they still are on the registration list. They can go to a vote center and vote in person, or they can call the voter hotline and request and be sent a replacement ballot. So this doesn't limit their ability to vote, but it just says that we're not going to automatically mail them a ballot because they are now in the list maintenance process.
Okay, fantastic. Continue.
Okay, moving on to section 4. This relates to assisting a voter at a polling location or a vote center. So a qualified voter can request the assistance of an election official or of 1 or 2 people of the voter's choice. And this would be to have that assistant go into the ballot booth with that voter and help that person to vote. So we are proposing to both amend the oath that the assistant would have to take and the qualifications of who can be an assistant to match the oath and the qualifications that exist in the special needs representative. So you may recall a special needs representative is someone who is allowed to take a ballot away from a vote center and take it to the voter who may be in the hospital or for some reason is unable to leave their home. They're allowed to have a ballot taken to them by a special needs representative. And so this sort of makes these two match in parallel, that if somebody's assisting a voter either by going into the voting booth with them or taking a ballot to them into their home, that they have to sign an oath saying that they will not vote the ballot for the voter, will not coerce the voter into voting for a specific candidate or issue, or divulge the votes cast by the voter, and that the voter assistant, similar to the special needs representative, can't be the person's employer, agent of the employer, officer or agent of the union of the voter, candidate in the election, or a paid or unpaid campaign worker for a candidate or relating to a ballot measure.
Okay. Any questions about this new section? Continue, Ms. McConnell.
Thank you. Moving on to section 5. This is about replacement ballots, and here's a place where we are changing the word tabulated to counted. So this says, when we send out a replacement ballot, the municipal clerk shall keep a record of each request, and unless the first ballot received has been voided, it shall be the only ballot counted, because here we're really talking about the general accepting a ballot to go through the process of counting, not the actual tabulation of votes. So that's just a little clarification there. Moving on to section 6. This relates to the appointment and privileges of observers. We are clarifying that an observer registers generally for a single election. And we are clarifying that the number of observers depends on space or regulatory constraints. Here the limitations are 1 at a vote center, 1 per candidate or organized group at a vote center or polling location, but up to 4 here at the election center. But in those situations where there's, 13 candidates for mayor and 4 candidates in each school board race, you start saying 4 observers for each of those candidates, and you get to a number of people that we really can't manage here at the election center.
Ms. McConnell, hold on for a minute. Mr.
Yes.
Gates has got a question. Go ahead, Mr. Gates.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I have a question. I kind of think I know the answer, but I just wanted it to be really clear. And Ms. McConnell, you referred to the difference between counting and tabulating earlier on that amendment, changing tabulated to counted. And I just want to make sure that this is very clear to everybody that the count determining whether the ballot is counted happens first for that ballot. And that's based on the ballot envelope review and the determination that this will be counted. And then tabulation is what happens second. So as opposed to saying it's the general process, it's the first process determining that the ballot will be counted based on envelope review. Tabulation is counting who the votes are for after the ballot's been separated from the envelope. Is that correct?
Thank you, Mr. Gates. I think that's a really good way to explain it.
Thank you, Mr. Gates. Thank you, Ms. McConnell. Ms. Lafrance has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question pertains to section 6, number B3. And Ms. McConnell, just to clarify, a candidate is entitled, regardless of whatever the venue or space, to a minimum of 1 observer. Is that correct? And the reason why I just am wanting to clarify is just because of the line that says, if the municipal clerk determines at the clerk's sole discretion that the election process can accommodate at least 1 observer. So yes, then my question is just, is that a minimum always of 1 observer, or is that determined by the space as well? Thank you so much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Franz.
Thank you, Ms. Lafrance. So this issue is addressed more specifically in the observer's handbook, but it basically says that there may be situations where we are unable to accommodate even 1 observer per candidate. So in that situation, the clerk asks for voluntary cooperation to have 1 observer observe for multiple candidates. But if the clerk is unable to get the observers and the candidates to agree to voluntary cooperation, then there will be a drawing of lots to determine who gets to observe based on the number of people that can be accommodated.
Understood. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. LaFrance. Continue, Erica.
Okay, thank you. The next section here in C proposes a timeline for registering observers based on whether we're talking about a regular or a special election, a runoff election, or a recount. And the purpose of setting a timeline is so that the observers will be able to go through a training that will support the observers' understanding of the election processes, which can increase their effectiveness. So the proposal for a regular election is that observer registration forms would have to be submitted anytime between the day after the last day to withdraw from the ballot. So that's usually right at the beginning of February, all the way up into the day before ballots are mailed, which is mid-March. And that would be the timeline for a regular election. Special election has similar deadlines. In a runoff election, the proposal is that if an observer is registered for the regular election, they can then also, they don't need to re-register for a runoff election as long as the candidate they're observing for is in the runoff election. but that new observers would have a period of 10 days to submit registration forms in the runoff election. For a recount, and in the recount section of code, it says that candidates who have an interest, a specific interest in the recount, may have up to 2 observers at the recount. The idea is that if the observer is registered in the election that the recount is applying to, then they don't need to re-register. But if there are new observers specifically for the recount, they would have to submit their registration form at least 24 hours before the start of the recount. If they submit later than that, they'll be processed based on staff availability.
Okay, thank you, Ms. McConnell. Continue.
Okay. This change here in D1B is just to be more clear. This has created confusion in the past that the candidate or the campaign manager have to be the person who signed the observer registration form. And then down here under, what section are we in? E4, we have changes regarding the rules for observers while they are at a polling location, vote center, or designated return location. And these rules clarify the rules about taking photos, recording video or audio, and they encourage the directing of questions to the municipal clerk or designee, and deal with following instructions and following the Observer's Handbook. And I do want to point out that the Observer's Handbook is adopted as part of municipal code, and we will be bringing to the next meeting of this committee, which is next week, a update of the Observer's Handbook that for your review, so that when if this is introduced for assembly action, that the changes to the Observer's Handbook will be brought forward as an attachment to this ordinance.
Okay, great, thank you. Continue, Ms. McConnell.
Okay, moving on to section 7. So this is the section that I referenced back at the beginning when I was talking about adding a definition of the word tabulate. So the previous language here said no ballot shall be counted before 8 p.m. But I really liked Mr. Gates' sort of explanation that, you know, the envelope is processed for counting, but then we come to, after that, we come to tabulating the votes. And so we're proposing the change to this language to really say what we mean, that it's no votes shall be tabulated before 8 p.m. on election day, because, you know, it is certainly possible, as some of you have experienced, that any point prior to election day, we may know the number of ballots that have been received to date and will be counted. But of course, we never would know any tallying of the votes before or after 8 p.m. on election day. So we feel like this is good clarifying language.
Yeah, makes good sense to me. Okay, continue, Ms. McConnell.
Thank you. In section 8, this is a conforming change to a change that the Assembly approved in January of this year. So in January of this year, in section A1, you agreed that a ballot received from a military or overseas voter could be counted if it was received by, or would not be counted if it was received after noon on the day of certification. So we had this earlier section that says, here's when a ballot won't be counted, but we did not make a conforming change in this section that talks about when a vote by mail ballot will be counted. So this is just a conforming change that says the alternative. We've already talked about when it won't be counted, and it will be counted if we receive a ballot from a military or overseas voter not later than noon on the day of certification of the election. And this gives 4 extra days for ballots to arrive from military or overseas locations, because ballots from other places have to be received by the start of the public session of canvass, which is usually the Friday before the Tuesday of certification.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. And that's a good catch. So we can get that corrected, and so it. Anyway. All right. Thank you. Continue.
Thank you. The next section 9. So 9 and 10 relate to each other. So this language here in 9 is taken from a later place in code and moved to this location. And this basically says, if a voter casts a ballot containing races or propositions for which they're not eligible to vote, then we only count the votes in the races where they were eligible to vote, and we create a facsimile ballot for those situations. So this language is taken from here, 2880.010, and it's just moved to a place that we felt was a location that made more sense from an organizational standpoint. And then the other issue, so this B that is being deleted, deals with 2 issues. It deals with improper ballots, so when a voter votes in a race in which they're not eligible, and then it also deals with damaged ballots and says if a ballot is damaged so that it can't be, this uses the word tabulated, then you facsimile it as well. And the issue about damaged ballots is actually already addressed at 2880.050A. So it was unnecessary in this location. So we've deleted this entire section at 010B. We've moved the issue about improper ballots up to 005D, and the other sections already dealt with. So sorry if that was a little confusing.
No. Okay, good clarification.
Okay.
All right, thank you. Continue.
Section 11. This is a section, and I apologize, maybe I should have put the text in here, but it basically says that when the clerk is going to tabulate after 8 p.m. on election day, the clerk needs to have observation by either the ombudsman, the director of IT, or the municipal auditor. And what that person is observing is tabulation, not counting, as we've been discussing. So this just corrects that title to be more specific and correct about what we're talking about in that section. Moving on to section 12. This really is about votes. This is the section that deals with adjudication and the rules that we apply to adjudication. So this is about the votes and not the ballots. So here in A, we've just made some rewording and clarifying about the machinery and the equipment that we use. And then in section B, we're talking about the adjudication of votes using the following rules. So we are making some changes that mostly clarify the issue of write-in votes. And so this language up here, marks for both a write-in and a candidate named on the ballot shall not be counted. In the regular election, that would be considered an overvote because you would have a vote for a candidate and a vote for a write-in. But there may be a situation, which I'll explain in a minute, down in section B12, where you might end up counting that. So I'll get to that in a second. I'm going to skip to 12. I'll come back to 11, 12 and 13. So I'm going to start at 13. A write-in vote is not counted for a candidate. So first of all, here in a runoff election, and we're just clarifying or explaining that because there is no space for a write-in candidate on a runoff ballot, as we've discussed earlier and clarified earlier. We do not count a write-in vote for a service area supervisory board if the candidate has not registered as a qualified write-in. So any write-in for a service area board has to basically have declared their candidacy to be a write-in, and they can do that up to 7 days before the election. Or unless there are more write-in votes than votes for any candidate in the same race, except as relating to this service area board. So if the top candidate gets 100 votes, but there are 120 write-in votes, then we start looking at the write-in votes and counting those write-in votes to see if there's one candidate who was written in who got more than 100 votes. So moving back up, again, we're not looking at the write-ins during a regular election, assuming there are fewer write-in votes than the top candidate. But in a recount, we start potentially looking more carefully at the write-in votes. So in a recount, a vote for a candidate named on the ballot shall be counted if the voter also wrote in the same candidate's name on the write-in line and filled in the corresponding oval. So this goes back to what I was talking about up here, that if the candidate votes for, if the voter votes for John Smith, the candidate, and also writes in John Smith on the write-in line and votes for the write-in, technically that's an overvote. But down here in the recount, we can tell that the intent of that voter was to vote for John Smith. So we can count that vote for John Smith in the recount. The other situation that we're proposing to count is if the voter writes in John Smith's name in the write-in line, but they didn't fill in the corresponding oval for either John Smith, the candidate, or John Smith, the write-in. We can still, in a recount, determine that the voter's intent was to vote for John Smith, and so we can count that vote in a recount. So that's the proposal for clarifications regarding write-ins. And then up here in section 11 about in order to vote for a write-in candidate, it says here you have to mark the oval preceding the candidate's name, but we're proposing to carve out that exception that I just talked about here, where in a recount, if they wrote in the candidate's name, but they forgot to fill in the oval, we can still count that vote during a recount. So again, it's a little complicated, but that's the basis for changes in this section regarding adjudication of votes.
Well, it's important if you can ascertain what the voter's intent was, and that way you can actually count that ballot, and it makes perfect sense to me. Any questions from members of the committee about this section? Not seeing any. Proceed, Ms. McConnell.
Thank you. And then the very last proposal for this section is to clarify and make very specific that a registered observer can challenge the adjudication of a vote under this section by submitting a form to the clerk that sets forth with specificity the rule that has been improperly applied by election officials in this section. Okay, and then we're almost at the end here. So the last section, the last proposal we have for a change is here in the procedure relating to a recount. And we have just two minor changes. One is that we're comparing the recount results, just kind of getting rid of that word count, which again can be a little confusing. And then we're moving the text that is here in C2 down into a new section D, because it is applicable to all recounts, not just certain recounts that are set forth in this otherwise section. So it's just a clarification and a moving of this language. And with that, we're at the end of this proposed ordinance. So I'd be happy to answer any questions and remind you that we will be having proposed changes to the Observer's Handbook ready to present to you at next week's meeting.
Okay, thank you, Ms. McConnell. Any questions from members of the committee about anything that was recently covered or covered in this presentation? I see Ms. Lafrance is typing. Ms. Lafrance, do you have a question or a comment?
Sorry, Mr. Chair, not sure why it showed up as typing. I don't have a question right now. But thanks for being so observant.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think that covers what we have on the agenda right now.
Mr. Chair,
Ms. Jones.
as a procedural matter, we have this on your agenda for your work session next week. And we recognize that, code drafting and getting our heads around some of these terms and words is complicated. And so it could be really helpful to the elections team if the members would like to review the drafts that were sent to you. And if you have any additional questions or comments, if you would like to send those to us, we can take a look at those and then be prepared to answer them or make any additional changes at your next meeting.
Okay.
And Mr. Chair, if I could just, I meant to say this at the beginning, but for the members of the public, this draft is available on the Ethics and Elections Committee website.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Kennedy has a question. Go ahead, Ms. Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson, Mr. Chair. Actually, it's more of a comment. And I will say that, I appreciate a lot of the clarification that's gone in here, particularly in making better distinctions between some of the definitions. But I will tell you right now, I do have some serious concerns about the idea of the potential of excluding all observers with the option of just drawing, having a lottery to select one from some campaign to observe. So I'm going to look at that a little bit more, but I will probably oppose that particular one and would hope that we would make sure that we keep it at allowing at least one observer per candidate. So anyway, that's the only part that I'm really wrestling with right now. So just a heads up. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, can I address that? Just make a comment?
Yeah, yes, Ms. Jones, continue. Go ahead.
Ms. Kennedy, that is actually in current code, which is interesting. It's in the Observer's Manual, which the Assembly adopted. And I understand your concern. I think the reality of having 13 mayoral candidates and 4 school board candidates and ending up with 52 observers in the election center is remote. It certainly is remote, but that's what that's based on. And I think that we would be happy to take a look at that with you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Jones. Mr. Gates, I see you have your hand up. Do you have a comment or question?
Oh, sorry, I forgot to put my hand down from earlier, Mr. Chair.
Okay, no problem. Any other comments or questions from committee members or from Ms. Jones or Ms. McConnell? If not, I guess I don't know if we have any old business to discuss. Does anyone have old business they want to bring up? Not seeing any. I guess we can go to audience participation.
Hello? Hello?
Sounds like
Hello?
Mr. Haberman. Go ahead, Mr. Haberman. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you. I'll set my timer. My name is Eugene Carl Haberman. I represent myself. Follow the public process. When the public process is done appropriately, decision made by the governing body is more likely in the public interest. First, I'd like to point out and concern the municipal clerk's in charge of elections. I'm not questioning that at all. But the elections are Anchorage's elections, not another city that you be involved with. At a meeting that you had, a assembly special meeting, which I attended at City Hall, it was dealing with setting the date for the election, dealing with the recall, whether or not to recall some member as Zalatel. The Barbara Jones municipal clerk noted the concern about when that election was going to be, and how it needs to be in a way that doesn't interfere with the other election she's involved with Juneau. At that meeting, I strongly protested the situation. Your priority is dealing with only election you should be involved with is the Anchorage's election, not anywhere in the state. And where in this country is any other city involved with another city's election? I asked that question then, and I bring that up again now. And what you're doing is absolutely incredible. Who approved it? Key administration people that day when it was mentioned at that meeting. Key member says, when did it all happen? Who decided that? And again, who decided that? When did the assembly ever approve that? When did the previous administrations ever approve that you would be involved with other cities' elections? And now you've got an election dealing with an issue dealing with the recall of Assemblymember Zalatel. You can't be doing two different things, and you have no business to be involved with another city's election. And ignoring this is really deeply concerning, and it should concern everyone in the state, and particularly the people in Juneau. How they are being silent on this issue is amazing, and how assembly members and administration here are silent on the issue that you are involved with other cities' elections. Stay with your own election, not another city's election. And I'll close with that, and thank you very much with all due respect.
Thank you, Mr. Haberman. Anyone else would like to participate in audience participation? Not hearing anyone. I guess I'll accept a motion for adjournment.
Move to adjourn.
Hello? Hello?
Oh,
Hello?
okay.
Can you hear me?
Introduce yourself, please.
My name is Francesca Allegrezza. I would like to also say I agree with Eugene Haberman. And I was also wondering if the lawsuit where the state took away witness signatures will still be in effect for these upcoming elections that was changed by a judge and didn't go through legislation. Will witness signatures be needed on ballots, or is it a free-for-all? And I would also want to put on record that I am against mail-in voting, and I would like that to go back to in-person voting. And that's all I have.
Okay. Thank you for your participation. Anyone else like to participate?
Are you able to hear me?
Yes, introduce yourself. You have 3 minutes.
Yes, sir. My name is Alanoa Nickel. I am, I know who my rep is. My zip is 99508. I don't know where to start, but
I feel like just the fact that this was brought up, some changes to the meeting, what was to be discussed during this meeting was just brought up so prematurely that not enough members of the public knew that these changes were coming. That's kind of suspect, and it's like the next best thing to a violation of the public's trust. And I really feel like votes from another city shouldn't be gathered and counted somewhere else, even though there are observers. There has to be a way to just count the votes and tabulate them. Well, maybe you can tabulate. The whole tabulation thing seems a bit complicated, and it just mires transparency. So maybe you could just have people, or maybe you could count the votes and tabulate them as they're being casted, and it's live streamed, it's under surveillance, it's completely transparent, and this would involve not keeping anyone's vote a secret or private. These are public positions. Your votes should be open to guarantee transparency of elections, and it's like this whole thing needs to be overhauled because it seems like a long and complicated process, and one of the side effects of this is the police being, sick on the public if they keep pushing and pushing, and you have bureaucrats just hiding behind people that are just doing their jobs, which is our people in blue. But thank you for your time, and I'll be more cohesive and a bit more have a bit more clarity next time I join you guys. Sorry. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your comment. Any other member of the public that would like to participate? Ms. Lafrance, do you have a question for the clerk?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I meant to ask this sooner. If either Ms. Jones or Ms. McConnell could just do a quick recap of the process ahead. I understand that the changes, which are part of the annual code review, have gone to the commission, but just what, kind of timeline and opportunity for public engagement is available. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Lafrance. Ms. Jones or Ms. McConnell?
Thank you, Ms. Lafrance. So we have preemptively scheduled 3 meetings for this committee to review this document and the associated Observer's Handbook. So those meetings include today's meeting, a meeting next week on September 29th, starting at noon, and that might be called a work session, and then a meeting on October 13th, starting at noon. Should we reach a point where members of this committee wish to introduce this ordinance to the full assembly, we would recommend that there be a work session before the full assembly and that there be a minimum of 2 public hearings in front of the full assembly. We have asked the Election Commission to review this ordinance, and they are holding a public meeting next week. I believe it is on the 30th, but it is publicly noticed for them to review. And so we will be able to report back on their review to you at your October 13th meeting.
Great. Thank you, Ms. McConnell. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Lafrance. Thank you, Ms. McConnell. Susan Riley, do you have you want to have a comment or audience participation?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd just like to thank the staff for what I think was a really concise and well-organized presentation. Thank you for leading us through it so expeditiously.
You're welcome, and thank you for the comment. Anyone else that would like to participate in the audience participation section? Not seeing any, I'll take a motion for adjournment.
Move to adjourn.
Thank you. This meeting is adjourned. And our next meeting will be next Wednesday, the 29th at noon. Thank you.